In June 1967, a war that lasted only 6 days reshaped the political map of the Middle East. Its duration was brief, but its consequences were profound. Borders shifted, power balances changed, and a regional conflict evolved into a defining chapter of modern geopolitics. The Six-Day War did not begin suddenly. It was a culmination of nearly 2 decades of tension, unresolved disputes, ideological rivalry, and strategic miscalculation. To understand how the conflict erupted in June 1967, it is necessary to revisit the fragile aftermath of earlier wars. The origins of the crisis can be traced back to 1948, when the State of Israel was established. The Declaration of Independence was followed immediately by war between Israel and several neighboring Arab states. When the fighting ended in 1949, armistice lines were drawn, but no lasting peace agreements were signed. Israel survived, but hostility remained. The Arab states did not formally recognize its legitimacy. The years that followed were marked by periodic violence along borders, infiltration raids, and retaliatory operations. None of the underlying political disputes were resolved. Refugees displaced by the 1948 war remained in camps across the region. Jerusalem was divided. The Gaza Strip came under Egyptian administration, and the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. By the mid-1950s, tensions escalated again. In 1956, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, previously controlled by British and French interests. In response, Israel, Britain, and France launched a coordinated military operation. Israeli forces moved into the Sinai Peninsula. Although the campaign achieved military success, international pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced a withdrawal. The Suez Crisis left a lasting imprint. Israel withdrew from Sinai, but gained assurances regarding freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran, a critical maritime passage linking Israel to the Red Sea. A United Nations emergency force was stationed in Sinai to separate Egyptian and Israeli forces. For a time, the border stabilized, yet the deeper rivalry continued to grow. During the 1960s, Arab nationalism surged under Nasser's leadership. He positioned Egypt as a central force in the Arab world. His rhetoric emphasized resistance to Israel and opposition to Western influence. Across the region, political movements drew inspiration from this vision. At the same time, Israel continued to strengthen its military capabilities. The memory of past wars reinforced a belief that security depended on deterrence and preparedness. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, Israeli leaders viewed rapid mobilization and preemptive capability as essential to survival. The regional atmosphere grew more volatile in 1966 and early 1967. Skirmishes intensified along Israel's borders with Syria. Disputes over water resources in the Jordan River basin heightened tensions. Syrian-backed Palestinian guerrilla activity increased. Israel responded with retaliatory strikes. In April 1967, an air battle between Israeli and Syrian forces resulted in the downing of several Syrian aircraft. The confrontation raised alarm throughout the region. Then, in May 1967, events accelerated dramatically. The Soviet Union informed Egypt that Israeli forces were massing near the Syrian border. The intelligence was inaccurate, but it triggered a chain reaction. In response, Nasser ordered Egyptian troops into the Sinai Peninsula. He demanded the withdrawal of the United Nations emergency force stationed there. Within days, UN forces complied. The buffer separating Egypt and Israel disappeared. Soon after, Egypt announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. For Israel, this was a direct threat. The passage was vital for trade and strategic access. Israel had previously declared that closure of the straits would be considered an act of war. Across the Arab world, military mobilization intensified. Jordan entered into a defense pact with Egypt. Iraqi forces began moving westward. Syrian rhetoric hardened. Regional media predicted confrontation. Inside Israel, the atmosphere was tense. Reservists were called up. Civil defense preparations began. The memory of 1948, when the young state had faced invasion from multiple fronts, remained vivid. Israeli leaders debated their options. Diplomatic channels were explored, but no breakthrough emerged. The situation was defined by uncertainty. Would Arab forces attack? Would international diplomacy intervene? Would deterrence hold? For weeks, mobilized armies faced each other across desert lines and fortified borders. The region stood on edge. Within Israel's leadership, the strategic debate centered on timing. Waiting risked allowing Arab forces to strike first. Acting first risked international condemnation. The decision would shape not only the coming days, but the geopolitical future of the region. By early June 1967, the tension was unsustainable. On the morning of June 5th, Israel launched a massive preemptive airstrike against Egyptian airfields. The war had begun. On the morning of June 5th, 1967, shortly before sunrise, the balance of power in the Middle East shifted within hours. Israel's leadership had reached a decisive conclusion. Waiting any longer would increase vulnerability. Egyptian forces were deployed in Sinai. The Straits of Tiran remained closed. Regional alliances were consolidating. Israeli intelligence assessed that war was increasingly likely. The strategic decision was based on a central military doctrine. If surrounded by larger armies, Israel could not afford a prolonged, multi-front war. It needed speed. It needed surprise. And above all, it needed air superiority. Operation Focus began at approximately 7:45 a.m. In a carefully coordinated maneuver, nearly the entire Israeli Air Force took off in waves, flying low over the Mediterranean to avoid radar detection. Only a small number of aircraft remained behind to defend Israeli airspace. The gamble was enormous. If the attack failed, Israel would be left dangerously exposed. The primary targets were Egyptian airfields. Israeli pilots had trained extensively for this moment. They understood runway patterns, aircraft positions, and response protocols. The initial objective was not merely to destroy planes. It was to crater runways, preventing Egyptian aircraft from taking off. Within minutes of arrival, bombs struck Egyptian air bases across Sinai and the Nile Delta. Aircraft parked wing to wing were destroyed before pilots could scramble. Control towers were hit. Communication lines collapsed. The surprise was nearly total. Egypt's air defenses were unprepared for the scale and precision of the assault. Confusion spread rapidly. Many Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Others were caught attempting to take off. By midday, the Egyptian Air Force had been effectively neutralized. Hundreds of aircraft were lost in a matter of hours. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. Air superiority, often decisive in modern warfare, was secured by Israel on the very first day. Without control of the skies, Egyptian ground forces in Sinai became vulnerable to aerial attack. But Operation Focus did not end with Egypt. Israeli aircraft turned toward Jordanian and Syrian airfields. Despite initial hesitation among some Arab commanders, Jordan had entered the war after receiving reports, later proven inaccurate, of Egyptian success. Jordanian artillery began shelling West Jerusalem and other targets. In response, Israeli aircraft struck Jordanian air bases. Soon after, Syrian airfields were attacked as well. By the end of June 5th, the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria had suffered devastating losses. The first phase of the war had lasted only hours. Its consequences would define the remaining days. Air supremacy allowed Israeli ground forces to move with relative freedom. Egyptian positions in Sinai were subjected to sustained air attacks. Supply lines were disrupted. Communications faltered. Meanwhile, Arab leaders faced a rapidly deteriorating situation. Initial reports from Cairo had suggested success. Radio broadcasts proclaimed Egyptian victories. Yet the reality on the ground contradicted these claims. As the scale of losses became clear, the narrative shifted. The psychological dimension of the war became as significant as the military one. In Israel, successful airstrike generated cautious optimism, but the war was far from over. Ground battles were intensifying. Egyptian forces in Sinai remained numerous. Jordanian and Syrian fronts were active. The decisive question was whether Israel could translate air superiority into rapid territorial gains before international pressure forced ceasefire. Speed was essential. Israeli armored divisions advanced into Sinai, aiming to outmaneuver Egyptian formations before they could regroup. In the north, forces prepared to respond to Jordanian shelling and potential Syrian engagement. The conflict was no longer hypothetical. Within a single day, the strategic environment had transformed. A regional standoff had become an open war, and its first chapter had already altered the military balance. The skies over the Middle East now belonged to one side. The ground war would determine the rest.
With air superiority secured in the opening hours of June 5, 1967, the focus of the war shifted decisively to the ground. Nowhere was this more critical than in the Sinai Peninsula. Sinai was vast, harsh, and strategically essential. It served as a buffer between Egypt and Israel, but it was also the staging ground for Egyptian forces mobilized in May. Thousands of troops, armored divisions, artillery units, and fortified defensive lines had been deployed across the desert. Egyptian strategy relied on depth and numbers. Defensive positions were established at key junctions, Abu Ajila, Rafah, El Arish. The expectation was that Israeli forces would face a grinding desert campaign, but Israeli doctrine emphasized mobility. Instead of direct, frontal assaults alone, Israeli commanders planned rapid armored maneuvers designed to outflank and encircle Egyptian units. Speed was critical. With international pressure building for a ceasefire, Israeli leaders understood that battlefield realities would determine diplomatic outcomes. On the southern front, Israeli forces moved toward the Gaza Strip and the Rafah salient. Fighting there was intense. Egyptian defensive positions were fortified and manned by experienced troops. Yet without air cover, these positions were vulnerable. The Battle of Rafah marked one of the first major ground engagements. Israeli armored brigades, supported by paratroopers and artillery, pressed forward against entrenched Egyptian units. Casualties were significant on both sides. But gradually, Israeli forces gained the upper hand. Simultaneously, a more complex operation unfolded at Abu Ajila. This position was considered one of the strongest Egyptian defensive points in Sinai. It consisted of minefields, artillery batteries, anti-tank defenses, and infantry strongholds. A direct assault risked heavy losses. Instead, Israeli forces executed a coordinated night operation involving armor, infantry, artillery, and paratroopers. Under cover of darkness, units maneuvered around defensive positions while artillery targeted command structures. By dawn, Egyptian defenses began to collapse. The fall of Abu Ajila opened the path deeper into Sinai. As Israeli forces advanced, the scale of Egyptian disarray became increasingly apparent. Communications had been disrupted. Orders were inconsistent. In some sectors, Egyptian commanders ordered a general retreat toward the Suez Canal. The retreat, however, quickly became chaotic. Convoys of military vehicles moved westward across narrow desert roads. Without air cover, these convoys were exposed. Israeli aircraft, operating with near-total freedom, struck retreating columns. Equipment was abandoned. Units became disorganized. The speed of the collapse surprised even Israeli commanders. Within days, major cities in Sinai, including El Arish, fell. Israeli armor pushed westward with remarkable momentum. The Suez Canal, long a symbol of strategic rivalry, now stood within reach. Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, fighting continued. Urban combat and close-quarters engagements occurred in densely populated areas. By June 6, Gaza was effectively under Israeli control. The Egyptian High Command faced a critical situation. President Nasser, initially relying on reports of resistance and counterattack, confronted the reality of rapid territorial loss. Radio broadcasts shifted tone. The narrative of victory gave way to calls for resilience. International actors watched closely. The Soviet Union monitored developments with concern. The United States, while officially urging restraint, was deeply aware of the shifting balance. The possibility of superpower confrontation lingered in the background. But on the battlefield, events moved too quickly for diplomatic intervention to shape outcomes. By June 7th, Israeli forces had reached the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. The entire Sinai Peninsula had effectively fallen under Israeli control. In just 3 days, a theater of war that many had expected to last weeks had been decided, yet the war was not over. While Sinai collapsed, another front intensified. The West Bank and Jerusalem, and in the north, Syria remained engaged. The Desert Campaign had demonstrated the power of air supremacy combined with rapid armored maneuver. It had also revealed the vulnerability of static defensive doctrine when communications and coordination break down. But the political consequences of Sinai's fall would extend far beyond the battlefield. Territory had changed hands. The regional balance was shifting, and Jerusalem, divided since 1948, was about to become the focal point of the war.
While Israeli forces advanced rapidly across Sinai, a second and deeply symbolic front erupted to the east. Jerusalem had been divided since 1948. West Jerusalem was under Israeli control. East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its religious sites, was administered by Jordan. The city was not merely strategic, it was political, cultural, and spiritual ground of immense significance. On June 5th, shortly after Israel's airstrikes against Egypt, Jordanian forces began shelling West Jerusalem and central Israeli cities. The decision followed communication from Cairo suggesting Egyptian success in the south, information that proved inaccurate. Israeli leadership initially sought to avoid widening the conflict. Messages were sent through diplomatic channels indicating that Israel did not intend to attack Jordan if Jordan refrained from engagement. But the shelling continued. Jordanian artillery struck residential areas. Sniper fire intensified along the dividing lines within Jerusalem. The fragile status quo that had held for nearly 2 decades collapsed within hours. The conflict on the West Bank began in earnest. Israeli forces moved swiftly to neutralize Jordanian artillery positions surrounding Jerusalem. Paratrooper brigades were deployed. Armored units advanced toward key strategic corridors, including Latron and Ramallah. The terrain of the West Bank differed sharply from the open deserts of Sinai. Here, steep hills, narrow roads, and urban centers defined the battlefield. Fighting was often close-range and intense. One of the most critical engagements occurred at Ammunition Hill, a fortified Jordanian stronghold in northern Jerusalem. The position had been heavily defended and overlooked key access routes. Israeli paratroopers launched a night assault under heavy fire. The battle was fierce and costly. By morning, the hill was secured. The path toward East Jerusalem began to open. Meanwhile, Israeli units moved across the West Bank, capturing cities including Jenin, Nablus, and Bethlehem. Jordanian forces, facing their superiority in coordinated ground maneuvers, began to withdraw eastward toward the Jordan River. On June 7th, Israeli forces entered the Old City of Jerusalem. For the first time since 1948, the city was under unified control. The moment carried extraordinary symbolic weight. Religious and political leaders across the region reacted strongly. For Israel, the capture of East Jerusalem and the Western Wall represented a profound historical moment. For the Arab world, it signified a deep loss. International reaction was immediate. Jerusalem's status had always been sensitive. Its religious importance extended far beyond regional politics. As images and reports spread, global attention intensified. By the end of June 7th, the entire West Bank was under Israeli control. The speed of the campaign mirrored events in Sinai. What had begun as artillery exchanges escalated into full territorial transformation within days. Yet the implications were different. Sinai was strategic territory. The West Bank and Jerusalem carried political and demographic complexity. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians now found themselves under new administration. The war had redrawn not only borders, but governance realities. The front with Jordan effectively collapsed after the fall of Jerusalem. Jordanian forces retreated across the river. The central theater of war shifted northward. Only one major front remained active, Syria and the Golan Heights. While Sinai had demonstrated mobility and Jerusalem had embodied symbolism, the Golan Heights represented high ground, literally and strategically. The final phase of the war would unfold there.
By June 8, 1967, two major fronts of the war had effectively collapsed. Egyptian forces had retreated across the Sinai Peninsula. Jordan had lost control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Only one major adversary remained fully engaged, Syria. Unlike Sinai's open desert or the densely populated West Bank, the Golan Heights presented a fundamentally different military challenge. The Golan was not merely territory, it was elevation. Rising sharply above northern Israel, the plateau provided commanding views over the Galilee region. For years before 1967, Syrian artillery positions on the heights had shelled Israeli agricultural communities below. These intermittent bombardments had created a constant state of tension along the northern border. From a military standpoint, the terrain favored the defender. The Golan Heights consisted of steep escarpments, fortified bunkers, interconnected trench systems, and minefields. Syrian defensive lines were positioned along narrow ascent routes. Attacking uphill against entrenched forces carried high risk. Initially, Israeli leadership hesitated to open a third major ground front. With Sinai secured and the West Bank captured, some within the Israeli cabinet believed that expanding the war further could provoke direct Soviet involvement. The Soviet Union had close ties with Syria and had supplied significant military equipment. International pressure for a ceasefire was intensifying. Yet military commanders in the north argued that leaving Syrian artillery intact would mean returning to the pre-war status quo, one defined by periodic shelling and instability. The opportunity to neutralize that threat might not come again. On June 9th, after internal debate, the decision was made. Israeli forces would attack the Golan Heights. The assault began with heavy artillery bombardment and concentrated airstrikes targeting Syrian bunkers and supply lines. Air superiority again played a decisive role. Syrian positions, though fortified, were vulnerable without effective air cover. Ground forces advanced through narrow corridors under intense fire. The climb was brutal. Syrian defensive networks had been prepared for years. Concrete bunkers were embedded into hillsides. Anti-tank positions covered likely approach routes. Minefields slowed movement. In several sectors, Israeli units faced direct, close-range combat. Despite these obstacles, Israeli forces employed coordinated armored and infantry tactics similar to those used in Sinai, rapid maneuver combined with concentrated firepower. Engineering units cleared mines under fire. Paratroopers secured elevated positions to prevent flanking counterattacks. Casualties were heavier than in some earlier engagements. But Syrian command cohesion began to falter. Communication breakdowns, conflicting orders, and uncertainty regarding broader strategic developments weakened organized resistance. Some Syrian units withdrew prematurely, fearing encirclement. By June 10th, Israeli forces had breached key defensive lines and advanced toward Quneitra, a central town on the heights. Reports circulated, some exaggerated, that Israeli forces were advancing deeper into Syrian territory. Panic spread within segments of the Syrian command structure. Quneitra was evacuated before full engagement occurred. Later that day, a ceasefire was announced. The war had lasted 6 days. In less than a week, the territorial map of the Middle East had been transformed. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights. The scale of change was unprecedented. From a military perspective, the campaign demonstrated the impact of preemptive airstrikes, rapid armored maneuver, intelligence coordination, and decisive operational tempo. Air supremacy had shaped every front. Once achieved, it allowed ground operations to unfold with strategic flexibility. But the political consequences extended far beyond battlefield success. The capture of the Golan Heights removed the immediate artillery threat to northern Israel. However, it also introduced new strategic complexities. Syria did not accept the loss. The plateau would become a long-term point of contention. Across the Arab world, the shock was profound. The defeat was not incremental, it was decisive. Arab governments face internal criticism and political instability. President Nasser of Egypt initially announced his resignation, though mass demonstrations later persuaded him to remain in office. Public sentiment across the region demanded accountability and renewed resistance. The war also altered global dynamics. The United States and the Soviet Union moved cautiously to prevent escalation. Though neither superpower engaged directly in combat, both had provided military equipment and political backing to regional actors. The speed of the conflict limited their ability to intervene meaningfully before outcomes were determined. In diplomatic forums, debates began immediately regarding the future of the newly occupied territories. Should they be retained for security? Returned in exchange for peace agreements? Administered temporarily, these questions would define the next decades. The Six-Day War had ended militarily, but politically it had only begun. The borders drawn in June 1967 would shape future conflicts, negotiations, uprisings, and peace processes. The war created new strategic depth for Israel, but also new demographic and political realities. It marked a transition from interstate war to a prolonged and complex territorial dispute. 6 days had changed the map. The consequences would last generations. When the guns fell silent on June 10, 1967, the military phase of the Six-Day War had ended, but the political consequences were only beginning to unfold. In less than a week, Israel had quadrupled the territory under its control. The Sinai Peninsula extended to the Suez Canal. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were no longer under Jordanian administration. The Gaza Strip was no longer under Egyptian control. The Golan Heights overlooked northern Israel from a new strategic angle. The regional balance of power had shifted dramatically. For Israel, the war created what military planners described as strategic depth. Prior to 1967, the country's narrowest width was less than 15 kilometers. Major population centers lay within easy artillery range of neighboring states. After the war, buffer zones expanded. Defensive geography improved. Yet strategic depth came with political complexity. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza now lived under Israeli administration. The question of governance, temporary occupation or permanent control, became central. International law, security concerns, and demographic realities intersected in ways that would shape future decades. The status of Jerusalem intensified global debate. Israel declared the unification of Jerusalem and expanded municipal boundaries. The move was not recognized internationally, and the city's status became one of the most sensitive issues in global diplomacy. In November 1967, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 242. The language was carefully constructed and deliberately ambiguous. It called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and affirmed the right of every state in the region to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. The interpretation of this resolution became a matter of dispute. Did it require withdrawal from all territories, or withdrawal from some territories in exchange for peace agreements? The ambiguity reflected the diplomatic balancing act of the Cold War era. Arab states responded in September 1967 at the Khartoum Conference with what became known as the three no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. The immediate prospect for negotiated settlement were limited. The war also reshaped internal politics across the region. In Egypt, President Nasser's credibility suffered, though he retained power. Military restructuring began. In Syria, leadership instability intensified. In Jordan, the loss of the West Bank fundamentally altered the kingdom's demographic and political landscape. For the Palestinians, 1967 marked a turning point. The conflict shifted from primarily interstate war to a more complex national struggle. Palestinian political organizations gained prominence. Armed resistance movements expanded their activity. The conflict entered a new phase, less defined by conventional armies and more by asymmetric engagement and political mobilization. Globally, the Six-Day War reinforced perceptions of Israel's military capability and operational efficiency. It also deepened Cold War alignments. The Soviet Union increased military support to Arab states. The United States gradually strengthened its strategic relationship with Israel. The region became more militarized, not less. The ceasefire lines established in 1967 hardened into new frontiers of tension. Along the Suez Canal, artillery exchanges resumed within months in what became known as the War of Attrition. Skirmishes along the Jordan River continued. The Golan Heights remained a fortified zone. The next major confrontation would come in October 1973. The Yom Kippur War was, in many ways, a direct consequence of 1967. Egypt and Syria sought to reverse territorial losses and restore strategic balance. The shock of 1973 demonstrated that the effects of the Six-Day War were neither final nor uncontested. The territorial outcomes of June 1967 continued to shape diplomatic negotiations into the present. Peace treaties were eventually signed between Israel and Egypt in 1979, leading to Israel's withdrawal from Sinai. Jordan signed a peace agreement in 1994. Yet the status of the West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights remained central to regional politics. The Six-Day War was brief in duration, but its legacy is ongoing. It demonstrated the impact of preemptive military doctrine under existential threat. It revealed the vulnerability of regional coalitions when coordination fails. It reshaped national identities and political narratives. Above all, it transformed the Middle East from a landscape of contested borders into a prolonged dispute over territory, sovereignty, and recognition. 6 days. 6 days altered geography. 6 days redefined strategy. 6 days reshaped diplomacy. And decades later, the consequences remain unresolved.